product, then oh, then our economy is doing well. Um, and just as an explanation of what's sort of lying under that bizarre statement, so the gross domestic product of a country is how many assets it has minus how many liabilities it has. So, what is an asset? Which is a great question. An asset is an individual commodity or an individual thing that is a discrete thing. It's a thing in and of itself, and it can be bought and sold on a market. And that is what an asset is. Seems pretty value free, pretty straightforward, right? Um, but to just give an example of how it isn't, it's actually all about power relations and who has power and who can wield power, um, and the converse of that, who doesn't have power and who can't. Um, in the 1800s, we didn't have GDP in the 1800s, but if we did, um, the southern states of the US overnight would have had their GDP halved. Can anyone guess why? Slavery. They abolished slavery. So what we define, so prior to them abolishing slavery, slaves were an asset, right? They were an individual thing that could be bought and sold on a market. And after the abolition of slavery, that was no longer true. So we decided that human beings couldn't be defined as assets. And therefore, all these people that owned these slaves suddenly didn't have any assets anymore. So the GDP, we didn't measure GDP then, but it plummeted. And I think that's a really stark example. And there are a lot more modern and relevant examples to today that I could talk about when we get to the questions. But just an example of when these things in this very scientific language come up, they're often not. The language often sort of masks the power relations underneath and the fact that this is all politics. There's no such thing as pure economics. It's all politics. It's all about power. So, um, yes, that is. Sorry, I'm just looking at my notes and what else I said I would talk about. Um, yes, so it's all about power relations. The other thing is if we're thinking about individuals competing in markets to maximize profit or utility, there's also a lot of other things outside of that we as a society care deeply about that can't be included in markets. Things like friendship or beautiful scenery. User in Hexham, most of yous. Yeah, you can't really put a price on that. And when we prioritize this one market driven way of thinking about the economy, we miss out all of those other things and we're unable to value them effectively. And this results in various crises. So, one crisis that I often like to talk about is the care crisis. So, we are in a situation where we are unable to care for vulnerable people in our societies well. We pay carers an absolute pittance, and the care that we deliver to the elderly population, to the young population, and to vulnerable adults in between is well below par. And there's many examples of crises in care. Um, and I just wanted to talk about how this way of thinking about economics creates that crisis. So if you run, say, a care home for profit, it sort of fundamentally gets in the way of what you're trying to do. And I'll try to explain why. So in order to have a really effective company, you want to produce as much as you possibly can for as little as you possibly can. And that's increasing productivity. That's called good productivity. When you put a little bit in and you get a lot out, that's a really productive company. But when we think about industries like care, like relational industries where it's human beings interacting with each other, the thing that you're trying to create, like the thing that you're trying to get the most of is time. And time is a very difficult thing to increase, right? Time is a finite thing. We can't do much about that. So the only way that you can increase the amount of time that an individual spends with another individual is by increasing the amount of individuals that one person cares for. So if you want to make it as productive as possible, you're going to have one person looking after loads and loads of people, and that reduces the quality of the care. The other way that you can decrease the amount that you put in is by paying people a pittance, is by lowering wages. So when you, as we know, care workers earn very little money. So when you think of a thing that is is two humans interacting, so that's education, that's care, that's healthcare, The only way you can make that as profitable as possible is by reducing wages or by decreasing the level of care. Because the thing that we want to get out is as much money as possible. Put in as little, get out as much. And it just doesn't, that model of working just fundamentally is not appropriate for the caring industries. Um, Another great crisis that we all are is at the top of our minds is the climate crisis, right? There are a huge amount of resources in the ground that nobody owns. And indeed, the air that we breathe, you can't privatize the air that we breathe. So these things end up being external to markets. They call them externalities. So because it doesn't actually cost anybody any money to pollute the air, then that doesn't really count as a thing that we're worried about. In fact, they often give a really good example of um, if you pollute a river as an organization, you I don't know, have some sort of waste product that pumps into rivers, that does nothing to affect GDP. That does nothing to affect our overall thing that we're aiming for with an economy. But cleaning that up, you've got to hire people, right? You've got to hire people to clean up the river. So actually, it ends up being really good for GDP. You pollute the river, then you have to employ a load of people to clean up the river. So actually, the pollution in the end of the day worked out as a good thing for the economy. Um, yeah, so they're just two examples of how thinking about economics in these terms and putting the market at the center of every way that we think about economics and having the ultimate goal of our economies is to maximize and accumulate profits is really fundamentally opposed to some of the things that we as humans care about in our lives, the environment, care, and various other things. So that's what's wrong with the economy. And the question actually was, how do we build economies that work? Um, and as I say, what I think is the fundamental core of what is wrong with the economy is this idea that maximizing profit is the thing that we're trying to do. So in order to build economies that work, I think that's the first thing that has to go. We have to build economies that meet the needs of humans, and that basically one of the most pressing needs that we have is a planet that functions and a planet that is what's the word? Habitable and that we can all live on. So it's also building economies that serve the needs of the environment as well. Um, and how we do that is an open question, right? So I would propose, so I worked for a few years on a project called the Social Guarantee, which still has a website, and I suggest you go and look at it. It's pretty interesting. And the idea of the social guarantee is that no matter who you are, no matter where you are, no matter when you are, no matter what, human beings, there are fundamental things that we all need to be able to live a fulfilling life. Um, and these are objective things that we need. This is not a subjective thing. We all need a safe and secure place to live. We all need good food and water. We all need an education. We all need to be able to get around. Nowadays, we all need internet access. It's very difficult to get the things that you need without internet access. Um, so these fundamental things that we all need to be able to live in society, it should be the role of the economy to provide those things first and foremost. And then anything else that you need is sort of gravy. We can figure. I'm not like anti-markets. There are industries that markets function really well in and that they work very well in. But the first job that we should be doing as an economy is meeting these human needs, and we should be doing that by whichever means is most appropriate, right? So, for example, um, delivering a national rail service, which seems like a sensible thing to do, that would make sense to deliver that at a national level. That would make sense for a state to deliver a national rail system because you're going to have to link up over all sorts of different regions. However, providing domiciliary care, providing home care in a neighbourhood, that's probably not best done by the state at large. That's probably done best by local people who understand the demographics of the area, understand the culture of the area, and as I mentioned earlier, I don't think a for-profit model works for providing care. So what you would want is something like a local care cooperative where carers are able to decide, and the care receivers are able to decide the best ways to do that and then provide that service. So it's not about having this one size fits all model that we need to nationalize everything or we need to privatize everything. It's about thinking, what is the service that we're providing? What is the context in which we're providing it? And what is the best way to do that? Which will, the end goal will be we will have provided that service the best. Um, and as I say, that will vary from place to place. So, like, I live in Whitley Bay. What it means to insulate homes and make them future-proof and low carbon in Whitley Bay, which is a coastal town, is completely different to what that might mean in central Birmingham. So it's about thinking about what is the service that we're providing and what is the best way to deliver that. That means that the goals of that service, be that making warmer houses, reducing carbon, providing good care, making sure people can get to the doctors, that aim is achieved in the most effective way. Um, there are like a bunch of different models of doing like particularly local economic development, but in general just economics across the board that are active and working in in the world today. One of the ones that I know the most about is called community wealth building. That's a model of local economic development. And the idea behind community wealth building is that this model that we currently have, the mainstream economic model that I've been talking about, they describe it as being very extractive. So it extracts resources from the ground, right? It extracts wealth from areas, it extracts labor. You have towns where people have to move out because there's not enough opportunity there. Obviously, we are depleting the resources in the ground and in the air and in the water. Um, and often it's because we have the people who own the things locally don't live locally, and that money isn't retained locally. So a really good example that I use of how you can practice community wealth building, um, the where it started was Cleveland in the US by this organization called the Democracy Collaborative. They sort of came up with this whole thing. And they have this massive private hospital called the Cleveland Clinic. And this huge hospital was getting all its laundry done because hospitals have to get their laundry done. And it was just shipping it out and getting it done at the cheapest price. And what they did in Cleveland was build these local cooperative laundry services. And they went to the Cleveland Clinic and they're like, we have a local laundry. Let us do your laundry. And then that money will stay in the community. It will employ people in the community and it will lift up all of Cleveland. And importantly, they did it at a competitive price. So now that hospital, rather than shipping out all its laundry and that money leaving Cleveland, we have a thriving laundry cooperative in Cleveland that has social value at its core. So it hires a lot of ex-cons. It's in really deprived. It's in a deprived part of town, and then it's managed to lift up Cleveland and keep that wealth in Cleveland in a way that wouldn't otherwise be possible. So that's the sort of like shining example of community wealth building. But you don't have to go as far as Cleveland to see it. In the UK, we tend to call it the Preston model because about 15 years ago, that's where it started in the UK. A guy called Matt Brown, who was a councillor in Preston, convinced the council to develop to adopt this way of doing local economic development. And as a result, Preston, local institutions in Preston, like the hospital, like the local authority, like the university, like the police constabulary, all started rethinking about how they procured goods. And that has managed to boost Preston, as well as Preston now has this thriving cooperative sector that other places don't have. And I would encourage you to have a look at how what the numbers are behind that because it's really quite impressive. So community wealth building is a great way of doing it. There's also a big movement that talks about the foundational economy, and this is particularly pertinent in the Northeast, and it actually was quite a large part of Kim McGuinness's manifesto. Um, the foundational economy is those parts of the economy that are based in a place and aren't going anywhere. So we have this like narrative around economics that we can't do anything good because the businesses will up and leave and then they'll all be in wherever and we won't get any of the benefits of that. But your hairdresser can't up and leave because it needs to cut your hair. Like Tesco's can't up and leave because they're in a place and people need to buy those things. So there are industries that just cannot leave. They are by nature place-based and they can't go anywhere. And these are the industries that we talk about being part of the foundational economy. And that includes, I mean, the definitions are woolly and that not everyone agrees, but it includes all sorts of different types of organisations. A huge part of the public sector is place-based. If you think about transport, education, healthcare, these things are all have to be in the place. But then it also includes private businesses like hairdressers, like supermarkets. Um, and it actually makes up a huge part of our economy, and particularly in the Northeast. I should have probably looked at the figures before I came on, but it's something. It's over 70% of the economy in the Northeast is by the foundational economy. So most people are employed in the foundational economy, and most of the services that we access are in the foundational economy. But when we talk about boosting the economy nationally, we always talk about these like small sectors like big tech or like whatever. I can't think of another one. But a very small amount of people actually work in big tech. So if we boost big tech, it's only really going to go into the pockets of those people, and it's actually not going to have a material impact on what we are doing day to day. It's not going to improve our schools. It's not going to improve our libraries. So the foundational economy people argue that what we should be doing is investing in these sectors. They're not very jazzy and they're not very sexy. But if we boost the foundational economy, we're going to boost everywhere, everyone and everywhere, because that's where everyone lives and that's where everybody procures these services for themselves. So, yes, that's another way to build an economy that works. Finally, I'll talk very briefly about the donut economic labs. I imagine quite a lot of you have heard of Kate Raworth's donut economics. Um, the donut came about, I don't know, about 20 years ago, but it's this really wonderful idea that there's in the middle of the donut. I probably should have got a picture of a donut as well. In the middle of a donut is all of the things that we need to live a good life. So that's all the things I was talking about earlier. That was what we used to concentrate on at the social guarantee. These are the objective things we need: education, housing, transport, the rest of it is in the middle of the donut. And if everybody has these things, we'll all live a good life. On the outside of the donut are the limits of our planet, right? So the planet that I saw Kate Raworth ages ago, and the way she described it, which I really loved, is the planet can absorb stuff, right? The planet's a bit like your body. If you go out and get really pissed one night, you're probably going to be fine. Like you'll be a bit hungover the next day, but your body's got what it needs to heal from that shock, right? But if you get that pissed every single night, ultimately your body will shut down because it can't handle it on that scale. So the planet can handle some shocks, right? The planet can handle some increased carbon. It can handle like nitrogen dipping in oceans, but what it can't do is handle it forever. And we've built an economic system that just keeps pumping carbon out and keeps depleting the nitrogen in the oceans and keeps depleting topsoil. What we need to do, so on the outside of this donut is basically what the planet can handle. So you've got in the middle is what humans need, and on the outside you've got what planets can handle. At the minute, we're not meeting the needs of all humans by any stretch of the imagination, and we are massively exceeding what the planet can handle. And Kate Raworth orders, that's not the word I meant, proposes, I suppose, that what we need to do is find a way to run our economies that sits in this sweet spot in the donut, so meets the needs of humans and doesn't exceed our planetary boundaries. I don't think at the minute there's a single country that has succeeded in doing this. Um, but it's called DEAL, Donut Economic Action Labs, is an organization which again I would encourage you to go and look at. And they work in local places, they work on national levels, they work across the world with communities and with governments thinking about how they could reform the economies in their places to make sure that they're in this sweet spot for humanity, meeting human needs and not exceeding planetary boundaries. Um, yeah, so I think that's probably it. That's probably all I've got to say. But that's some yeah, some ideas for how we could build better economies and some examples of why our economy isn't working. I hope it was clear. I know it's a lot of jargon. Thank you.
Well, that was great. Thank you very much, Maeve. I mean, huge subject and a whistle-stop tour, but it was all those places that we need to go to look also that you flagged up, which is really, really helpful. I'd just like to kick things off with a question because um, I'm involved in local politics, and I think there's a lot around resilience and local economics that we can affect on a local level. But we have often have unproductive but interesting conversations with other agencies about what's meant by best value. So when you were talking about the other elements, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that as humans we have things that we need that are not served by the profit model. I suddenly thought that they're embedded in best value, but best value has become about money. And it used to be that we looked at the social contract and social capital. So there's been these ideas floating around in the sector, and I've been in it for a long time, that have signaled that there should be there should be some acknowledgement of what you're talking about, our human needs as opposed to GDP. But they always somehow get translated into money. So my massive question for you is how do we do it? Sorry.
No, no. Well, actually, I'm really glad you asked that question because it's hard on Zoom because you kind of want to look at people, but I also have notes, but they're also on my computer. So I actually missed off the end of my talk that I was going to say, which really
Well, that's
relates
all.
to this. So that's great.
Oh, good, good.
Um, yeah. So again, like all of this, the community wealth building, foundational economy, like the done economics action labs, these are all really good models for like what we could do, but ultimately they are policy tools, right? Like which are very limited. And like you say, Penny, can be morphed and changed into whatever it is that the dominant sort of thing that the policymaker is sitting in needs that to be. And now that's just money and that's profit accumulation. And that's on a local level, like increased what the local version of GDP is, which is GVA, which is gross value added. So ultimately, and because as I said right at the start, economics, like everything else, is all about power. Who has power? Who wields power? Who doesn't have power? Um, and I think it has been proven by history, and I fundamentally believe that the only thing that we have in defense of organized money, which is the world in which we are sitting in now, is organized people. So you can have all of the wonderful policy ideas, you can have all of the theories, you can have all the proof of concepts, but without an active base of people saying we demand this change, then it all falls on deaf ears. So I spent the last, 15 years in the policy space with all these very clever people doing all these very clever policy ideas. And the idea, yeah, this is my own opinion, so please don't take offense. But but the whole theory of change, the whole way we were going to change the world in the policy space is that we come up with all this great idea, come up with all the evidence to back it up, do all the research, we get a progressive government in, and Bob's your uncle, the world's transformed. And that has not worked. We got a progressive government in, and nothing has changed. And I had a bit of a like dark night of the soul and was just like, how have we got this so wrong? And obviously, it probably won't come as a surprise to a lot of you, and it really shouldn't have come as a surprise to me. But yeah, vested interests are really, really powerful. And once you get into government, you become the elites, and then you are co-optable. And what the left has negated over the past however many years, or not done as well as it used to, is organizing people on the ground. And that's the collapse of the trade union movement, that's the collapse of institutions like the WEA, and that's the collapse of the cooperative movement. And without an organized people fighting for these ideas, then they will disappear into the ether because organized money has got its shit together and it knows what it's doing. So our primary job now is to organise people on the ground. So things like this, the Hexham debates, like having talks of political speakers coming in and sharing ideas with people and having people share their own experiences is a huge part of that. So yeah, in answer to your question, how do we stop it getting co-opted? We really need to like activate the base and organise people.
Great, thank you very much. So we've got a question from Andy. Um, Andy, do you want to ask your question? Andy C.
Yeah, okay. I've actually put
Thank
two
you.
down, but I'll just read the first one.
Okay.
Thanks, Maeve. That's been fascinating. One of the key things we need to fix, and it was top of your list of essentials for life, is housing. How can we do that when the cost of buying and renting continues to rise? How do we break that sort of circle? What can we do? What can economists like you do?
Thank you. It's a really, really fundamental question. And housing is a really interesting thing because, much like time, as I discussed in when I was talking about care, land can't be increased. There is a finite amount of land, which makes housing and land a very interesting economic good. Um, I'm trying to think of basically social housing is a way that you can. If you wanted to treat housing as an essential need, which is what it is, then we would increase the amount of social housing. So I'll do a little spiel about like how it's really important that we collectively own housing and provide that to people that need it. But then there is a sort of technical answer to your question that this amazing woman called Beth Stratford came up with a few years ago, which I will also touch on. Um, but yes, basically. I'm a real supporter of the idea that we should be collectively providing essential goods like housing. And collectively providing doesn't necessarily mean the state providing it, but it needs to be a not-for-profit model that's primary goal is providing that service, as I spoke about earlier. The problem with housing, what happened is we had a bunch of social housing that the state provided in kind. We all owned it. It was collectively owned, and it was provided to people in need. When we brought in the right to buy, we have an obsession in the UK of ownership, home ownership. That's like the primary way that we want to live in housing, which is a cultural thing. It doesn't exist in all places, and that is a thing that you can shift, but cultures are very difficult to shift. But yeah, around housing in particular. So Thatcher brought in this right to buy. So all of the social housing that we all owned, all got sold to private individuals. And then the way that we decided that we were going to make sure that people could be housed was to give them cash instead of an in-kind benefit, giving them money rather than giving them the house. So they had the money to buy the house, to buy the rent for the house, rather than the house itself. And what that ended up doing was this massive transference of money, public money, into private hands. So now we have a very small social housing sector and a massive private rental sector. Um, and all that, and when the government pays people housing benefits, all that does is give that government money to private landlords. And the cost of socially housing people, not social housing, but the cost of making sure vulnerable people can get, low income people can get into housing, has skyrocketed. We spend so much more on housing benefit than we ever did on maintaining the asset of the social housing. So I think what they're doing in London and they're doing in other places. In London, they call it the right to buy back. They call it other things in other places. Is that governments are buying up private rental stock and making it fit for purpose and renting it out as social housing. And I think that's such an important thing to do because we have a huge amount of houses. We talk about a housing shortage. People can't get access to housing, but as Andy pointed out, a lot of that is to do with how expensive housing is rather than the amount of housing and the amount of credit that has gone into mortgages is astronomical. Again, I should have looked up the stats before I came, but some ludicrous amount of debt in the UK is on housing. Like, again, something like 70%, like an insane amount of our national debt is mortgage debt. And it's not that we don't have enough homes, it's that we've pumped so much money into the housing sector, which all channels up to the banks and to the private landlords, that people can't afford to get on the housing ladder in the first place. So Yeah, more social housing and building, yes, but building's very carbon intensive, but we do need to build more social homes, but also buying housing stock that we already have and retrofitting it and yeah, renting that out at social rents is a really important way to do that. Um, the sort of technical thing, which I haven't said in a while, so let's see if I can explain it in a way that makes any sense at all. Um, the idea would be that you would have a community land trust. So you would have like a nationally owned entity that buys the land under the house. So individuals, the whole house and the land is hundreds of thousands of pounds, but the house itself needn't be that expensive. So in order to like give people access to cheap houses without bursting the housing bubble and then like reducing the value of all of our houses and which would have a very negative impact on people's day-to-day lives, homeowners' day-to-day lives, is that when an individual sells their house, they would sell the land underneath it to this community land trust, and they would sell the house to the person. So they would get the same amount of money for their house, and someone would be able to buy the house and be able to live in it. And meanwhile, a nationally owned, a collective owned entity would begin to own all the land under the houses. So it would be a way to have a collective asset. So the that land would, if the land was ever bought and sold, that would come back to the collective. But also individuals wouldn't, houses wouldn't just rapidly drop in value, and individuals would still be able to buy houses. Do not ask me any questions on that because I cannot remember the details. But I'll send Penny after this the paper about that, and it's a really interesting idea. And I highly recommend looking at anything Beth Stratford says because she's the best.
Lovely, thank you very much. Hugh, would you like to ask your question about the upcoming Scottish elections?
Uh, Oops. Yes, thanks a lot. It's a really interesting discussion, I must say. But I'm just looking at the leaflets that are coming through the door for the Scottish elections up here in Stirling. And it's all about how much we're going to do for the care sector, for transport, for everything else. There's nothing of the ideas that you've described there. So we have a hustings coming up next Tuesday, and I'm thinking, I mean, what you've described actually is not obviously not just a matter of feeding money into things. It's a matter of whole organization and local support for different ways. I'm just wondering if you have any practical suggestions that we can, first of all, put to to the politicians, and then I suppose you're going to tell us there are things we have to do as a community as well.
Well, actually, Scotland is really, so community wealth building, which was one of the examples that I gave earlier, they have passed a community wealth building bill in Scotland, and that is part of national government. And there are now metrics that local places are going to have to meet with regard to how they are retaining and keeping wealth within the local communities. So I would ask some questions about that because this it's such a incredible win. I think they're the first nation in the world to pass a bill around community wealth building, but it's not just that they it can't just be hot air from politicians. It's actually in legislation now that they have to be able to do this. So I would ask questions around that. Ask questions around the community wealth building bill and how they're ensuring that they're prioritizing local need and local wealth over over the profits
Yeah.
of private companies, and particularly when looking at housing and health. These things are it's not easy, right? It's not easy to overthrow a system, and it's not an easy job that politicians have. But in Scotland, you now have a legislative framework that
Mhm.
they have to adhere to. So I think asking them questions about that would be incredibly interesting. And if they thought about it and they have to think about it, so sort of holding them to account on that, I think would be pretty interesting.
Yeah, and alongside that is how you actually generate the money for generate the industries and others locally to create some of the wealth that you need to make some of these things work.
Absolutely, because a lot at the minute, community wealth building is a lot about procurement, and it's a lot about local supply chains. And so in Cleveland, like there wasn't a local laundry that could have done the hospital's laundry. So the first job was to create that local business. And a huge part of community wealth building has to be around. shortening supply chains and making sure these goods and services can be produced locally. And then like impressed in with the real push for cooperatives. It's like it's not small businesses do tend to be a lot more socially minded and a lot more
Mhm.
locally minded, and it's particularly when the business owners live in the place.
Mhm.
But even more than that, like organizations like cooperatives and community interest companies have got it built into their DNA. So it's about boosting those sectors locally as well.
That's great. Thanks for that. That's some really good thoughts there. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, Maeve, there's a question in the chat. I don't know if you can see the chat. Can you see the
Yeah.
chat? Which is quite a difficult question to summarize. David doesn't have a working mic. So, can you see that question
Yeah.
from David, which is about, I think it's meant to,
Shall I read it aloud?
you could try, yes.
Okay, Reevesian view. I assume that's talking about Rachel Reeves. We cannot spend more than we have. Okay. We cannot incur more debt. Prob. Okay. We cannot tax more. Why? We cannot tax the rich because they will leave. Evidence. If we don't follow this, GDP will fall. How does this differ from the traditional Tory economics? How Lawson, etc. But GDP is not the be all and end all. Question: can we maximize GDP experienced and valued by the poorest 50%, even if national GDP falls? I'm going to stop there. I'll just
Yeah,
speak to
yeah. No,
that.
no, that's
Yeah.
fine. Yeah. Thank you.
Um, right. We can't spend more than we have. This is an interesting one. Particularly interesting when it comes to social infrastructure. So like things like education and care. And this is like a point made by feminist economists repeatedly. So the way that it works at the minute is that we have the current account spending, which is this is what they say we can't spend more than we have. So like this is the idea um, that we bring in tax and we have to spend the tax revenues on and no more on public services. And the sort of thinking behind this is that they don't boost productivity. It's just like ticking along, right? But we can borrow more to invest in infrastructure. So we can borrow more to invest in roads and trains and Wi-Fi, and because the idea is that this physical infrastructure will boost productivity. Um, it is absolutely ludicrous. So this is what puts constraints on public spending because we do borrow money and we can borrow money, but we borrow it to invest in infrastructure that will boost productivity because the idea being that we'll get that money back, right? And then some more. But it's absolutely bonkers, and this is the argument of feminist economists all over the world, to argue that education and care doesn't boost productivity. If you have a well-educated workforce, that boosts product. Like we are the economy, right? The economy is not this separate entity. It is made up of all of our individual actions, all of our work, all of our purchases, all of our social interactions, right? Having a birthday party in a restaurant boosts the economy, right? It's much like a business. Like if you've got a workforce, if you've got somebody that's constantly calling in sick, that's not good for the business, right? You need people who are coming in and working. Um, and the sort of analogy that the idea that we can't borrow to invest in this stuff, like in healthcare, in education, in public transport, is so frustrating. It's like saying to a restaurant owner, saying wait until the economy grows to invest in public services is like saying to a restaurant owner, wait until your business is booming before buying an oven. It's ridiculous. The restaurant will never boom until you have an oven, until you have a well-educated, well-housed, well-fed population that are able to get around. You will not have a strong economy, and we have these fiscal rules and these constraints on public borrowing for public services um, that are I was going to say not fit for purpose, but that's too polite. They don't work. We realized in the 1800s, similar time to slavery, that unless we have an educated workforce, we aren't going to we're not going to have a strong economy, so we provided free schooling, right? We realized in the First World War, when the troops were conscripted and came and they were starving, that actually we need to have good food, so we brought in the rationing system, right? Like, this is arguments that we have won, and for some reason we have forgotten these arguments. So yeah, on the first part of the question, that we can only spend we can't spend more than we have, is bonkers, right? There's good debt and bad debt, right? There's maxing out the company credit card to go to the Maldives, bad debt, right? But getting a mortgage so that you have a safe space to live, or my ludicrously expensive student loans, like, that's good debt, because it means that my life is going to be better and I'm going to be able to function better, right? So yeah, that infuriates me. We cannot tax more. Of course, we can tax more, and our tax system is incredibly regressive. And there's another organisation that I would encourage you to look at. It's called Tax, and that's a guy called Aaron Advani who did a wealth tax commission a few years ago that was really great, and he's the best. So yeah, there are many, many, many ways we could change the tax system that would make it more progressive. There's also a lot of evidence, and Aaron's produced some of this, about how the rich don't leave if we tax them more. Because yeah, rich people grew up and have family here too, just like poor people, and they're not as keen to up and leave as sometimes it's suggested. And in how does this differ from traditional Tory economics? I really don't think it does. Um, I think again, this is this sort of organized money versus organized people argument. Like, we're living under the same system of organized money with a different government in power, and it's the money that's calling the shots, not the government. And we need to organize people to change that. And then, can we maximize GDP experienced and valued by the poorest without maximizing national GDP? I think the better thing is to just get rid of, well, maybe not get rid of GDP as a metric, maybe use it as one of many metrics that we use to measure how well the economy is doing, like like adult literacy rates, and like healthy life expectancy, and other things that we care about as a society. So GDP can be one of the things that we measure, but only in conjunction with all these other things that we value as humans. So yes, I hope that answered some of those questions.
Great, thank you very much. Can I just pick up on a point there? Are there any countries in the world who do not use GDP as the sole measure of economic prosperity?
So I think New Zealand. There's this wellbeing economy alliance called, or We All. Scotland's part of this. New Zealand's part of this, and some other countries. And I've not. This happened a few years ago. I've not kept up to date with this, but certainly they brought in well-being measures of the economy rather than GDP. Um, yeah, I think Bhutan has a happiness index that it uses rather than GDP. Um, but yeah, they're like isolated examples, but we haven't managed to achieve the sort of global shift away from away from GDP being the measure of how well the economy's going.
Right, great, thank you. There's been a question put in by David, but I think that you might well have answered that question. It's about, so can we borrow more to invest in ferries that don't work than in social capital? I think the answer is probably yes. Um, Jim wants to comment to the discussion. Can I bring Jim in?
Thank you. I'm familiar with community wealth building, but one of the values and themes, as you already say, is to have a look at the resources we extract from disadvantaged communities as a key thing. And one aspect to that in the Northeast is that I think it's 41% of women working who come from disadvantaged areas are getting less than the living wage. So here we have a resource extracted from the community, reflected in the living wage, and there's some local authorities in the region are still not paying a living wage and can't agree that on our doorstep. The other aspect, if I may mention it, the community wealth building has been very successful in Scotland in terms of responding to concerns of rural areas. And this is particularly important for Northumberland, as you probably know that the suicide rate in terms of people living in rural areas is higher pro rata than it is in urban areas. The community wealth building in Scotland has developed schemes where farmers actually learn to work with each other, of looking at where one person has skills and strength and the other. So rather than competing against each other, they're learning to work as a cooperative, which is not too common in Northumberland yet, as I understand it. So very important for rural concerns here.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. That's good point. I mean, I think we have an extractive economy, basically.
Yeah.
That's the model, isn't it, for across the piece? Thank you very much, Margaret Thatcher, who started the ball rolling. I've had a question from Pete, who is sitting next to me, who is doing the tech and also runs Hexham TV, where this will be posted, a recording of this, who's asked how does what's been said by you, Maeve, really relate to the defence industry and defence spending? A
Oh
small
God.
question.
Sorry.
So, yeah, Pete
Um,
apologizes.
I think yeah, I mean it does boost employment, I suppose. But it's a particular type of employment. Um, yeah, I mean it's and you could I'm by no means an expert in this, but you could yeah, you produce things locally, which would yeah bring money into and if it's nationally owned, like bring money back to the exchequer and into the local community. But I think the sort of feminist argument for this is like if you invest in things like care, you increase. It's predominantly women who work in care, and we have a massive um, women employment gender employment gap and a gender pay gap, and those sorts of industries address that. I um I am not an expert on defence. I probably shouldn't speak to that in that I haven't got very strong formed opinions on it and it's not my area of expertise. But yeah, sorry, I can't really answer that very well.
No, all right. He's accepted that, Maeve. I mean, but I think this raised an interesting point, actually, if I might say something about this, because you're talking about, if you like, identifying areas of the economy that need to be developed, supported, and measured in different ways in terms of value. And so, like health and education and care and all the rest of it. And I wonder whether, in a completely different way, defence is another example of that.
Well, I think the thing, as you were speaking there, I did remember a blog I read on this, and the thing is that you invest in defence and it only sort of supports defence, whereas you invest in other public services and it boosts the economy in the round because people use these and become more productive. Um, so if you are going to spend that money with a view to if the point of the defence spending is to boost the economy, you're probably better off spending that money on things that increase productivity on the whole, which is yeah, all the public services that I've been banging on about. So investing in defence doesn't do that in the same way or doesn't do that as effectively. However, I don't think that investing in defence, they're doing that to boost the economy. They're doing that to increase defence, right? So if it's a toss up, I guess the toss up is how much defence you want? What's the geopolitical circumstances that you're existing within, right? How important is that versus how important is it to provide a good life for the people in the country? And that is by no means a very simple question. And I do think that we have a lot more wriggle room with borrowing and taxation and all. We've got the idea that we have run out of money is I don't agree. There's a lot more wriggle room on how much money we could spend, and the way that we spend that money will how we spend that money depends on how productive it is and how much it increases people's livelihood. but there is a finite amount of money, and I guess the question is, do we spend that on increasing public services and the well-being of society, or do we spend that on defence? And yeah, like I said, it's not. I am definitely not qualified to answer that question.
Josephine, would you like to comment on this? You need to unmute, please.
Right. I just, as you were talking, I read somewhere, probably in the Guardian, or in the Quaker Friend. I mean, it's doesn't matter. But what okay, defence spending, it's maybe is necessary, but one looks at the structure of how that is put into action. That is the question that people are asking. You know, the various things that are going on internally. Nobody's looking at how efficient it is. I mean, we seem to have built various things which are, what's the word I want? Not superfluous, but they're out of date. They're already not working for us. We've spent billions on them, billions, and nobody's looking at that particular position of what is going to happen if we do more defence spending. Are we going to do the same as we've done in the last 20, 30, 40 years? This is a time to be looking at the structure and how these things are done. You know, I was just, yeah, this sounds awful, but I was just talking to somebody who'd worked in the RAF for a long time, and I'm surrounded by RAF because where I live, and you know, there doesn't seem to be a lot of energy. And I just think what that particular area needs is a huge amount of energy to go in and say, let's look at the whole structure of how you're actually getting the stuff. I can't think of the words for them, but it's really important. Anyway, you've just hit on something which I was just reading earlier. So yeah, I think we may have to have defence. I remember one of my fellow Quakers saying, you know, well, I'm not sure I want to be without an army. And that made me think a lot. But we've got to think of the way we spend that money. And it's our money. You know,
Yeah,
I'm always saying to everybody, this is our money. Whatever's going on, I go, this is ours. And I think we need to say
absolutely.
that more and more. Yeah.
And I think that sort of goes across the board, like the how is the money being spent? And I think obviously, particularly in the last government, there were lots of questions of cronyism and like contracts for mates and which again speaks to the point that you cannot extrapolate economics from politics, and you can't extrapolate questions of power and who has and wields power from economic decision making. So yeah, I think it's a really important point.
Well, that was a great point to finish on, Maeve, because it's 11:59. I'm sorry, Jim, we're going to have to shut this down, or cut this short is what I meant to say. Um, Sorry, dear, let's just shut it down.
Down.
And I mean, I think the fact there was a defence question, it was an interesting one right at the end, because of course the head of NATO and once a Labour MP has directly said we've got to cut benefit spending in order to fund defence, which I think is a stark example of how ridiculous and morally corrupt our economy has become.
Yeah.
So, Maeve, would you like to make any concluding remarks for us, please? Or would you
Well,
like
just
to
just to, just yeah, just to say thanks, and just to say again, like it's things like this that will create the change that we need. It's this organizing people, educating people, agitating, all of that. So it's just really, I'm very pleased that you invited me, and I'm very happy to be a part of it, a small part of it. So yeah, thank you very much.
Great, and that's really good. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next month's debate is on Saturday the 16th, when we've got Paul Rogers, a longtime friend of the debate, discussing peace in some form or other. We haven't got a title yet, but it was bound to be well informed and interesting and challenging. I'd just like to flag up that in June and July, Tyndale Transformed is running 2 face-to-face meetings, as we do. And I think what we're going to be looking at is about community organising in various forms. So we might see Maeve again, I hope. But there's a lot of activity going on, and it's about organising and consolidating and being tactical about it, I think. So those will be happening in June and July, and we will let you know about it. So thank you very much. Thank you very much to Hexham TV. If you know anybody who'd like to watch a recording of this, or you want to watch it again, it'll be on Hexham TV's uh,
Social media.
social media. And we will see you next month. And thank you once again to Maeve. And thank you for coming.